Welcome to Whispering Willow's Sleep, soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts and carry you toward peaceful sleep. Before we begin, tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. And, if you wish, what's on your mind? I read every note and love keeping quiet company across distances. If this brings you peace, a like and subscribe will help me make more Nightbound stories. And if you'd like to support even further, you can buy me a coffee through the link in the description. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The autumn light filtered through the windows of 221B Baker Street, casting honeyed shadows across the wooden floor. A gentle October breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke through a slightly opened window, where the distant sounds of carriage wheels on cobblestones formed a lullaby of London life. Mrs. Hudson paused, knife in hand, and tilted her head at the strange face emerging from beneath her careful cuts in the orange flesh of a pumpkin. Something about the way the candlelight would eventually shine through the eyes seemed knowing. As if this particular pumpkin had secrets it was not quite ready to share. London in 1897 had embraced the gentle mysteries of autumn with particular enthusiasm this year. The trees in Regent's Park had surrendered to spectacular shades of amber and crimson, while the ever-present fog had taken on a golden quality in the late October light. The city seemed to exhale more slowly as Halloween approached, as if savouring the brief, beautiful pause between the fading warmth of summer and the approaching chill of winter. In the sitting room of the most famous address in London, Mrs. Hudson worked with quiet determination. This would be her first Halloween party, an American tradition she had learned of from a cousin who had emigrated years before, and she was determined that it would be remembered for its attention to detail. The landlady of 221B Baker Street was known for many things: her patience with unusual tenants, her fortitude in the face of strange visitors at stranger hours, and most of all, her immaculate care of the rooms under her charge. Tonight, however, she was revealing a new talent, the art of pumpkin carving. Mrs. Hudson, I believe that particular specimen is beginning to resemble our friend Inspector Lestrade when presented with a particularly baffling case, came the deep, amused voice of Sherlock Holmes from his armchair by the fire. The detective had been quietly observing his landlady's artistic endeavours for the better part of an hour, his pipe sending lazy curls of smoke toward the ceiling. His tall, lean figure was relaxed in repose, but his keen eyes missed nothing of Mrs. Hudson's methodical transformation of simple vegetables into grinning sentinels. "Mr. Holmes," she replied without looking up, her hands steady, as she carved a crooked smile into the pumpkin's face. "If I were to create a likeness of the Inspector, I assure you he would appear far more dignified than this fellow here." A soft chuckle escaped Holmes as he rose from his chair, the leather creaking gently beneath him. He moved to the window, where the late afternoon light was beginning to soften into the gold-tinged grey of early evening. Below, Baker Street was alive with the usual procession of hansoms and pedestrians. But tonight there was something different. Children in simple costumes darting between adults, small paper lanterns bobbing in their hands like earth-bound stars. "I confess I find this American tradition curious," Holmes mused, watching a small boy dressed as what appeared to be a rather unconvincing ghost. The Celtic origins are fascinating, of course. Samhain, the night when the veil between worlds grows thin, but how it transformed into this parade of costumes and carved vegetables. That evolution contains its own mystery. Mrs. Hudson smiled to herself. Despite his protests to the contrary, she knew well that Sherlock Holmes harboured a deep appreciation for folklore and tradition, particularly those shrouded in history and transformation. His mind might feast on logic and deduction, but his soul responded to the poetry of human customs that connected present to past. My cousin writes that in America it's becoming quite the celebration, she said, placing the finished pumpkin on the mantelpiece and stepping back to admire her work. Children going door to door for treats, parties with games to divine one's future spouse. She says it's a night of innocent mischief and community. Innocent mischief, Holmes repeated thoughtfully. A curious contradiction, yet apt for a night when rules are gently bent, but not broken. He turned from the window, his eyes catching on something in Mrs. Hudson's collection of pumpkins awaiting transformation. That one, he said suddenly, pointing to a particularly round specimen with an unusual marking on its side. May I? Without waiting for a response, Holmes lifted the pumpkin, turning it in his long fingers with the same care he might afford a critical piece of evidence. Fascinating, he murmured, tracing the natural marking that resembled nothing so much as a question mark. Nature provides its own mystery. The sound of footsteps on the 17 stairs leading to the flat interrupted his contemplation. The familiar tread, slightly heavier on the right foot than the left, announced the arrival of Dr. John Watson well before he appeared in the doorway, his arms laden with books and his face flushed from the autumn chill. "Good heavens!" Watson exclaimed, taking in the transformed sitting room. "I appear to have walked into a harvest festival." Indeed, Mrs. Hudson had been busy throughout the day. Beyond the pumpkins in various stages of carving, autumn leaves had been artfully arranged along the mantelpiece, intertwined with deep red berries and sprigs of herbs that filled the room with a subtle, earthy fragrance. Small candles waited in crystal holders, promising to cast enchanting light once evening fully descended. The familiar cluttered room of case notes and chemical experiments had been temporarily tamed into seasonal splendor. "Dr. Watson," Mrs. Hudson greeted him warmly, taking his coat and hanging it by the door. "I was beginning to wonder if you'd return in time to help with the final preparations." Watson's kind face broke into a smile as he placed his bundle of books on a side table. "I wouldn't miss this for the world, Mrs. Hudson. And look, I've brought entertainment for the evening." He gestured to the books, their leather bindings worn but well cared for. Ghost stories, as requested, some classics, and a few lesser-known tales that should provide just the right atmosphere. Holmes set down the question-marked pumpkin and moved to examine Watson's literary offerings, lifting a volume and flipping through it with elegant fingers. "The Signalman" by Dickens, "Green Tea" by Le Fanu. Excellent choices, Watson, though I maintain that the most chilling tales are often found in my case files rather than in fiction. Which is precisely why we'll be reading fiction tonight, Watson replied with good-natured firmness. "Your case files give me quite enough sleepless nights as it is." The crackling fire sent shadows dancing across the walls as Mrs. Hudson returned to her carving. Watson settled into his customary chair with a contented sigh, and Holmes resumed his contemplative pipe, smoking by the window. The comfortable silence of long friendship filled the room, punctuated only by the soft scrape of Mrs. Hudson's knife against pumpkin flesh and the occasional pop from the fireplace. "I understand Mycroft has accepted your invitation," Holmes remarked after some time had passed, the statement directed at Mrs. Hudson, but his gaze still fixed on the street below. "Indeed he has," she replied, looking pleased, "and he's promised to bring those marvellous pumpkin pastries from that French bakery he favours." Watson's eyebrows rose in surprise. Mycroft, attending a social gathering? Willingly? The world must surely be coming to an end. Holmes's lips curved into a small smile. "Even my brother cannot resist Mrs. Hudson's hospitality, it seems. Or perhaps it's simply that he finds Halloween intriguing for the same reasons I do. A night when the ordinary world acknowledges, however briefly, that masks and mysteries are part of the human condition." The fading light outside turned the windows into mirrors, reflecting the warm interior of 221B back upon itself. Mrs. Hudson lit the first few candles, and their gentle glow transformed the pumpkins into otherworldly sentinels, their carved faces coming alive with flickering inner light. The effect was both eerie and comforting, precisely the balance that Halloween seemed to strike in the human heart. Watson leaned forward in his chair, his voice dropping to a storyteller's cadence. "Did you know, Mrs. Hudson, that in some parts of Scotland they still practice divination on Halloween night? Young women will peel an apple in one long strip, then toss the peel over their shoulder. The shape it forms on the floor is said to be the initials of their future husband." Mrs. Hudson's eyes twinkled with amusement. "And what shape did your wife's apple peel form, Doctor? A perfect W for Watson, I presume." "Mary claims it looked like an M, which is close enough." Watson chuckled, though she also admits she may have guided the peel's fall with a strategic toss. Holmes, who had been silent during this exchange, suddenly straightened at the window. "Inspector Lestrade approaches," he announced, "and in quite a state, judging by his pace." Indeed, moments later, the sound of rapid footsteps on the stairs heralded the arrival of the Scotland Yard detective, whose usual methodical demeanour had been replaced by an unusual sense of urgency. Lestrade appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath, his usually immaculate appearance somewhat dishevelled. Most notably, there appeared to be pieces of straw clinging to his coat. "Mr. Holmes?" Lestrade began, then paused as he took in the festive atmosphere of the room. "I beg your pardon, Mrs. Hudson. I didn't realize you were hosting a gathering." "Not until later this evening, Inspector," she reassured him. "You're quite welcome to join us, of course." "Thank you, but I'm here on rather strange business," Lestrade replied, his expression caught between professional seriousness and bewilderment. "We've apprehended a most unusual pickpocket in Covent Garden, dressed as a scarecrow, of all things. But it's what we found in his possession that I thought might interest Mr. Holmes." Holmes's eyes lit with that familiar spark of intellectual curiosity that Watson knew so well. A scarecrow pickpocket, how seasonally appropriate. And what did this straw man carry that brought you here in such haste? Lestrade reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, holding it carefully by the edges. "This letter, sir, written in what appears to be code, with mentions of pumpkins, newspapers, and what my men believe might be a blackmail scheme of some kind. Given the unusual circumstances and the, seasonal connection, I thought perhaps—" "You thought correctly, Inspector," Holmes interrupted, his hand already extended for the letter. "Watson, clear some space on the table, would you? Mrs. Hudson, might we trouble you for some tea? It seems our Halloween festivities may include a mystery after all. Mrs. Hudson, far from being put out by this interruption to her preparations, appeared delighted. A mystery on Halloween Eve? How perfectly appropriate. She moved toward the door, pausing only to add, "I'll bring up some of those spiced biscuits as well. Solving crimes is hungry work, as I've observed over the years." As Mrs. Hudson descended to her kitchen, Holmes carefully unfolded the mysterious letter, holding it to catch the best of the fading natural light. Watson and Lestrade gathered close, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the newly lit pumpkins. "Curious," Holmes murmured, his fingertips tracing the unusual lettering. "The paper is common enough, but the ink... Watson, do you note that peculiar bluish tinge?" "Indeed," Watson nodded, leaning closer. "Almost iridescent in this light. Not a standard ink, surely." "And the handwriting," Holmes continued, "educated but deliberately disguised. Note the inconsistent slant and pressure." His eyes narrowed as they moved across the page, absorbing every detail of the strange communication. Outside, the last rays of sunlight surrendered to the encroaching night. Within 200 B Baker Street, the carved pumpkins glowed with increasing prominence as natural light faded, their faces casting fantastical shadows that danced upon the walls. The familiar sitting room, usually a bastion of logic and reason, had transformed into a space where mystery and imagination held equal footing with deduction. The scent of Mrs. Hudson's spiced tea began to waft up the stairs, mingling with the earthy aroma of the autumn decorations. Lestrade removed his coat, revealing more stray pieces of straw that drifted to the floor like botanical confetti. "Perhaps you'd better start at the beginning, Inspector," Watson suggested, brushing a piece of straw from the table. "How exactly did you come to apprehend a scarecrow pickpocket?" Lestrade cleared his throat, looking somewhat embarrassed. "Well, it's a rather unusual tale. We received reports of a figure standing unnaturally still in Covent Garden, so still that passers-by thought it a Halloween decoration of some kind. Until, that is, it began to move and relieve them of their wallets and watches." Holmes looked up from the letter, his eyes bright with amusement. "A novel approach, hiding in plain sight by pretending to be an inanimate object. There's a certain elegance to it." "Perhaps to you, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade replied dryly. "Less so to the victims. In any case, when apprehended, the fellow had this letter tucked inside his costume. He claimed to be merely a messenger, paid to deliver it to a drop point later tonight. Given the coded nature and the mention of certain prominent names, I thought it best to bring it directly to you." The sound of Mrs. Hudson's returning footsteps interrupted the conversation. She entered bearing a tray laden with a steaming teapot, cups, and a plate of biscuits that filled the room with the warm scent of ginger and cinnamon. "Perfect timing, Mrs. Hudson," Holmes remarked. "We find ourselves with a Halloween puzzle that may require sustenance to solve." Mrs. Hudson placed the tray on the table and began to pour the tea with practiced grace. The amber liquid steamed in the candlelight, its spiced aroma adding another layer to the sensory tapestry of the room. "Will this delay our gathering, Mr. Holmes? I should notify the other guests if so." Holmes accepted his cup with a small nod of thanks. "Not at all. In fact, I believe this little mystery might add a unique entertainment to your Halloween festivities. What better night than All Hallows' Eve to unravel a coded message?" Watson took a sip of his tea, the warmth and spices creating a pleasant contrast to the growing chill of the October evening. Holmes, surely you don't intend to make your brother and our other guests participate in crime-solving on a social occasion? Why ever not? Holmes replied, his eyes glinting with mischief that made him momentarily appear younger than his years. Mycroft's analytical abilities might prove useful, and Mrs. Hudson's party will be remembered as entirely unique. Lestrade looked uncertainly between them. I'm not sure Scotland Yard would approve of turning evidence in an ongoing investigation into a parlour game, Mr. Holmes. Come now, Inspector, Holmes said smoothly. This is hardly an ordinary investigation, is it? A scarecrow pickpocket with a coded letter on Halloween Eve. The circumstances themselves read like a mystery novel. Besides, I suspect this particular puzzle will benefit from multiple perspectives. As if to punctuate Holmes's statement, the wind outside picked up, rattling the windows gently and causing the candle flames to dance within their pumpkin lanterns. The carved faces seemed to change expression with the shifting light, as if they too were intrigued by the mystery that had arrived so fortuitously on this most mysterious of nights. Mrs. Hudson, having poured tea for everyone, settled into a chair with her own cup. Well, I for one think it sounds delightful. A Halloween mystery to be solved by candlelight, with friends gathered round. My cousin in America will be positively green with envy when I write to her. Watson couldn't help but smile at her enthusiasm. When you put it that way, Mrs. Hudson, it does sound rather perfect for the occasion. Holmes returned his attention to the coded letter, holding it so the candlelight illuminated the strange text. The first step will be to determine what cipher has been used. From my initial observation, it appears to be a substitution of some kind, but with an unusual key. As Holmes spoke, a particularly strong gust of wind caused one of the window panes to creak, and the candle inside the question-marked pumpkin flickered dramatically, casting a series of rapid shadows across the wall that resembled dancing figures. How appropriate, Holmes murmured, glancing at the shadow display. Even our pumpkin sentinels are participating in the mystery. The fire crackled in the grate, sending up a shower of sparks that briefly illuminated the room with a golden glow. In that moment of heightened light, Watson noticed something about the letter that had escaped attention before. Holmes, he said quietly, hold the paper to the candlelight again, would you? Not too close, but yes, there. Do you see it? When held at just the right angle to the light, faint markings became visible between the lines of the coded text, a second layer of writing, previously invisible. Holmes's face broke into a rare, full smile. Excellent observation, Watson. Our mystery deepens, invisible ink, and on Halloween no less. The author of this communication has a sense of dramatic timing, it seems. Mrs. Hudson clapped her hands together in delight. Secret writing revealed by candlelight on All Hallows' Eve. It's like something from one of your ghost stories, Dr. Watson. Lestrade leaned forward, squinting at the faint markings. Can you read what it says, Mr. Holmes? Not yet, Holmes replied, carefully angling the paper to catch the light from different directions. But I believe with the proper application of heat, and perhaps a reagent or two from my chemical collection, we shall coax this ghost writing into full visibility. Outside, the last traces of daylight had completely vanished, leaving London wrapped in the velvet darkness of an October night. Within 221B Baker Street, the carved pumpkins glowed with warm purpose, casting their light on a gathering of friends united by the unexpected gift of a Halloween mystery. As Holmes rose to fetch his chemical apparatus, the doorbell rang, announcing the arrival of the first party guest. Mrs. Hudson hurried to her feet, smoothing her apron. "That will be your brother, Mr. Holmes. He's always precisely on time." Holmes's lips quivered into a small smile. "Indeed, and how fortuitous. Mycroft's particular talents may be exactly what we need to decipher our pumpkin papers." With perfect timing, as if the universe itself were orchestrating the evening's entertainment, the clock on the mantelpiece struck 6, its gentle chimes merging with the sound of Mycroft Holmes's measured tread upon the stairs. Halloween night at 221B Baker Street had officially begun. The footsteps ascending the 17 steps to 221B Baker Street were measured and deliberate, each one placed with the precision of a man who calculated every movement for maximum efficiency. Mycroft Holmes did not believe in wasted effort, whether in thought or motion. As he reached the landing, slightly more breathless than he would care to admit, the door to the sitting room opened before he could knock, revealing his younger brother's tall figure silhouetted against the warm glow of candlelight and jack-o'-lanterns within. "Mycroft," Sherlock greeted, a rare smile softening his usually stern features. "Punctual as the Greenwich time signal, as always." "Sherlock," the elder Holmes replied with a slight incline of his head. His shrewd gaze swept the festively decorated room, noting the presence of Watson, Lestrade, and Mrs. Hudson with a series of small nods. "I see I've arrived at a moment of some intrigue. Inspector Lestrade rarely visits for purely social occasions, and the trace amounts of straw on his coat suggest an unusual encounter." Sherlock's smile widened fractionally. "Your deductive faculties remain as sharp as ever, brother mine." Mycroft stepped into the room, carrying a large, elegantly wrapped box that emitted a gentle warmth and the faint aroma of spices and butter. "Mrs. Hudson," he said, turning to the landlady with unexpected warmth in his voice, "your invitation promised a traditional Halloween gathering. I've taken the liberty of bringing an appropriate contribution." Mrs. Hudson approached with genuine delight, accepting the box with careful hands. "Mr. Mycroft, how thoughtful. Are these from Patisserie Valentin?" "Indeed they are," Mycroft confirmed. "Their pumpkin pastries are, I believe, without equal in London. A recent innovation, combining traditional English spices with French pastry techniques. I find them most satisfactory." From Mycroft, this was equivalent to the highest praise. As Mrs. Hudson opened the box, the full aroma of the pastries escaped into the room, adding another layer to the sensory tapestry of the evening. The delicate constructions nestled within were works of art. Golden brown pastry shaped into delicate swirls, glistening with a light glaze, and arranged around a centerpiece that had been crafted to resemble a perfect miniature pumpkin, complete with a small pastry stem. "They're beautiful," Mrs. Hudson breathed, carefully setting the box on the side table. "Almost too lovely to eat." "Almost," Mycroft agreed with the ghost of a smile, removing his coat and handing it to Sherlock, who accepted it with a raised eyebrow, but hung it without comment. Mycroft Holmes presented a striking contrast to his younger brother. Where Sherlock was all angles and kinetic energy, even in repose, Mycroft possessed a solidity and stillness that commanded attention. His three-piece suit was impeccably tailored to his substantial frame, his watch chain gleamed softly in the candlelight, and his eyes, though the same remarkable shade as his brother's, observed the world with a different quality of attention, less intensely focused, perhaps, but wider in scope, as if perpetually considering not just the immediate scene, but its place in a vastly larger context. "Now," Mycroft said, settling his considerable bulk into the armchair that Sherlock had subtly positioned for him, the one furthest from draughts and closest to both the fire and the refreshments. Perhaps someone might explain why Inspector Lestrade appears to have been wrestling with a scarecrow on an evening when, by rights, he should be at home with his feet up, avoiding the inevitable mischief that accompanies this particular night in certain quarters of our city. Lestrade cleared his throat, looking simultaneously impressed and discomfited by Mycroft's accuracy. "It's rather uncanny, sir, how you Holmes brothers can tell so much from so little." "Not uncanny, Inspector," Mycroft corrected gently, "merely attentive. The straw adhering to your clothing is of a particular type used for cheaper scarecrow constructions sold in markets at this time of year. The slight abrasion on your right hand suggests a struggle, and your presence here, rather than at home, indicates a matter of sufficient interest to bring you to my brother on a social evening." "You see, Lestrade," Sherlock remarked, returning to his own chair. "Observation and deduction. No magic required, even on Halloween." Mrs. Hudson, who had been arranging Mycroft's pastries on her best china plate, tutted softly. "Gentlemen, perhaps we might allow the inspector to tell his story without further interruption. I, for one, am eager to hear it properly." Watson chuckled, raising his teacup in a small salute to Mrs. Hudson. "Wisely said. The floor is yours, Lestrade." The inspector straightened slightly, clearing his throat. In the dancing light of the jack-o'-lanterns, his usually matter-of-fact features took on a more dramatic cast as he recounted the tale of the scarecrow pickpocket and the mysterious letter. As he spoke, the room seemed to draw closer around them, the outside world receding as the strange narrative unfurled. "Most interesting," Mycroft murmured when Lestrade concluded, accepting a cup of tea from Mrs. Hudson with a nod of thanks. "May I see this letter?" Holmes retrieved the paper from the desk where he had been examining it and handed it to his brother. Mycroft held it carefully by the edges, turning it to catch the light from different angles, his eyes narrowing slightly as he absorbed each detail. "Curious," he said after a long moment. "The visible text appears to be encrypted, using at least 2 different ciphers interwoven, a technique I've encountered in certain diplomatic communications. The invisible portion revealed by the candlelight, however—" He trailed off, his expression thoughtful. "You recognize the method?" Sherlock prompted, leaning forward slightly. "Possibly," Mycroft replied. "There is a certain faction within the Foreign Office that employs a similar technique for communications of the most sensitive nature, though I would not expect to find their methods in the possession of a costumed pickpocket." Outside, the wind had picked up, sending occasional gusts against the windows that made the candlelight flicker and the shadows dance. The effect only enhanced the otherworldly atmosphere that had settled over 221B Baker Street, transforming the familiar sitting room into a space where mystery and reality intertwined like autumn mist among trees. The doorbell rang again, its cheerful chime a counterpoint to the gentle tension that had built during Mycroft's examination of the letter. "That will be the Watsons' neighbours, the Forresters," Mrs. Hudson said, rising. They were most intrigued by the idea of an American Halloween celebration. As Mrs. Hudson departed to greet the new arrivals, Mycroft carefully returned the letter to his brother. "I suggest," he said quietly, "that we continue this discussion more privately. Perhaps after the social obligations of the evening have been fulfilled. Holmes nodded, tucking the letter into his jacket pocket. Agreed. In the meantime, we might observe whether any of our guests display an unusual interest in our little mystery. Watson raised an eyebrow. You suspect one of Mrs. Hudson's guests might be connected to this affair. I suspect nothing yet, Holmes replied, but I rule nothing out, particularly on a night dedicated to disguises and deception. Mycroft's lips curved into the faintest suggestion of a smile. How appropriate that we find ourselves unravelling mysteries on the very night when, according to tradition, the veil between worlds grows thin and the hidden comes to light. The sound of voices and footsteps on the stairs announced the arrival of more guests. Mrs. Hudson led a middle-aged couple, the gentleman distinguished by an impressive set of mutton chop whiskers, the lady by a bonnet adorned with silk autumn leaves that trembled gently with her movements. Mr. and Mrs. Forrester, may I present Mr. Sherlock Holmes, Dr. Watson, Mr. Mycroft Holmes, and Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard. Mrs. Hudson introduced with evident pride in her illustrious gathering. Pleasantries were exchanged as the newcomers were settled with tea and offered the first selection of Mycroft's pastries, which they accepted with appropriate expressions of delight and admiration. The conversation shifted to lighter topics, the unseasonably mild weather, the increasing popularity of Halloween customs in London society, and the magnificence of Mrs. Hudson's pumpkin carvings. I've never seen such expressive faces carved into vegetables, Mrs. Forrester remarked, studying the glowing jack-o'-lanterns with genuine appreciation. They almost seemed to be following our conversation with those flickering eyes. Mrs. Hudson has many talents that continue to surprise, Holmes observed, his own gaze drifting to the pumpkin with the natural question mark pattern, which now sat on the mantelpiece, its carved features illuminated from within by a steadily burning candle. The doorbell sounded again, and soon the sitting room at 291B Baker Street was filled with a pleasant hum of conversation. As more guests arrived, a retired colonel with a passion for botany, a quiet librarian from the British Museum who spoke with unexpected authority on Celtic folklore, and a young couple recently returned from America who had brought a traditional apple-bobbing tub as their contribution to the festivities. Throughout it all, the Holmes brothers maintained an air of social engagement, while exchanging occasional glances that spoke volumes to those who knew them well. Watson, attuned to these subtle signals after years of friendship, understood that the mystery of the pumpkin papers remained active in their minds even as they participated in the gentle rituals of the gathering. Mrs. Hudson proved herself a masterful hostess, ensuring that conversations flowed, refreshments were replenished, and the atmosphere remained festive, yet relaxed. The carved pumpkins glowed with steady light, their faces seeming to shift expression as the evening progressed and the shadows moved across their features. I understand you've brought ghost stories, Dr. Watson, the librarian, Mr. Pembroke, remarked during a lull in the general conversation. Perhaps, if our hostess approves, we might indulge in the tradition of sharing tales as the evening deepens. Mrs. Hudson beamed at the suggestion. I was hoping someone would propose just that, Mr. Pembroke. In my cousin's letters, she describes how, in America, they gather around the fire on Halloween night to share stories meant to send pleasant shivers down the spine. Pleasant shivers, the colonel repeated with a chuckle. An interesting concept. Though I suppose there is a certain enjoyment in feeling safely afraid. the fear experienced from the security of one's armchair, with friends close at hand. Precisely, Watson agreed, reaching for the stack of books he had brought. I've selected a few tales that should provide just the right balance of mystery and comfort. As Watson opened the first volume, the wind outside rose to a gentle howl, as if nature itself were providing accompaniment to the evening's entertainment. The sound of distant church bells marking the hour floated through the night air, mingling with the wind's voice to create a haunting melody. "Before we begin with Dr. Watson's literary selections," Mycroft said unexpectedly, "perhaps the inspector might share a true tale of mystery from his professional experience. There is something particularly compelling about encounters with the unexplained drawn from real life." Lestrade looked startled at being called upon, but after a moment's consideration he nodded. "I do have one case that has remained unexplained, though whether it contains elements of the supernatural, I couldn't say." The group settled more deeply into their chairs, teacups held in expectant hands as Lestrade gathered his thoughts. The candlelight from the pumpkins cast his face in dramatic relief as he began his tale of an abandoned house in Hampstead, where objects moved without apparent cause, and messages appeared on fogged mirrors. "We never determined whether it was an elaborate hoax or something more inexplicable," Lestrade concluded, his usually pragmatic tone softened by the admission of mystery. A comfortable silence followed his story, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the occasional whistle of wind around the eaves. The guests sat in that pleasant state of suspended tension that good ghost stories create, a mixture of skepticism and willingness to wonder. "Most intriguing, Inspector," Holmes said finally. "Though I suspect if one were to examine the structure of the house closely, particularly the ventilation systems and the possibility of access points from adjacent buildings, a more terrestrial explanation might present itself." "Perhaps," Lestrade conceded. "But there are times, Mr. Holmes, when even I prefer to leave a mystery unsolved, especially on nights like this." The comment drew soft laughter from the gathering, releasing the gentle tension that had built during Lestrade's narrative. Mrs. Hudson seized the moment to offer another round of Mycroft's pastries, which were received with renewed appreciation. "These are truly exceptional, Mr. Holmes," Mrs. Forrester complimented Mycroft as she accepted a delicate pumpkin-shaped creation. "You must share the name of this patisserie." "Patisserie Valentin, in Marylebone," Mycroft replied. "A relatively recent establishment, founded by a Frenchman who trained under the great Carême before bringing his talents to London. His seasonal offerings are particularly noteworthy." "The French have elevated pastry to an art form," Colonel Winters observed, examining his own pastry with the same attention he might give to a rare botanical specimen. "The layering in this is quite remarkable." As the conversation turned to culinary matters, Holmes caught Watson's eye with a subtle glance toward the mysterious letter still in his pocket. Watson gave an imperceptible nod, understanding that Holmes wished to continue their investigation discreetly. Outside, a gentle rain had begun to fall, its soft patter against the windows adding another layer to the evening's sensory tapestry. The sound blended with the crackling fire and murmuring voices to create a cocoon of comfort around the gathering, a barrier against the darkness and mild chill of the October night. Mrs. Hudson, noticing the rain, smiled with satisfaction. "Perfect weather for ghost stories and warm company," she remarked. There's something about the sound of rain that makes indoor gatherings all the more pleasant. The guests murmured agreement, settling more comfortably into their chairs as Watson opened one of his books and began to read in his clear, measured voice. The story he had chosen, a tale of a traveller who encounters a strangely familiar figure on a lonely road, only to discover he has met a version of himself from another time, held the room in rapt attention. As Watson read, Holmes observed the faces of their guests in the flickering light of the jack-o'-lanterns, noting each reaction, each shift of expression. Mycroft, too, was watching, his seemingly relaxed posture belied by the sharp attention in his eyes. The mystery of the pumpkin papers would wait, Holmes decided. This moment, this gathering of friends and acquaintances under his roof, united in the simple pleasure of storytelling on a night dedicated to mystery, deserved its own attention. The case would unfold in its time, as all puzzles eventually did, under proper scrutiny. For now, the warm light of the carved pumpkins, the gentle rhythm of the rain, and the measured cadence of Watson's voice created a perfect harmony of Halloween enchantment at 220 Baker Street, a moment suspended in time like an amber droplet, preserving an October memory. The gentle patter of rain against the windows of 220 Baker Street had settled into a soothing rhythm, a natural accompaniment to the crackling fire and murmured conversations. Watson had finished reading his ghost story to appreciative murmurs from the gathered guests. The carved pumpkins glowed with steady amber light, their expressions seeming more thoughtful now, as if they too had been absorbed in the tale. Mrs. Hudson moved about the room with practised ease, refreshing teacups and offering more of Mycroft's exquisite pastries. The atmosphere had achieved that perfect balance found only in the best gatherings, comfortable enough for silence to feel natural, yet stimulating enough for conversation to flow without effort. "I believe," Holmes said during a lull, his voice pitched to carry just enough to catch the attention of those nearest him, "that this might be an appropriate moment to share our little Halloween mystery with the company. That is, if Inspector Lestrade has no objection." Lestrade, who had been deep in conversation with the Colonel about changes in London over the decades they both had observed, looked up with mild surprise. "I suppose there's no harm in it now, Mr. Holmes. The letter itself contains no specific information that could compromise any official investigation." "Excellent," Holmes replied, the candlelight catching the keen interest in his eyes. For those who arrived later, Inspector Lestrade encountered a most seasonal criminal today, a pickpocket disguised as a scarecrow who was found carrying a rather curious letter. With careful fingers, Holmes withdrew the folded paper from his pocket and held it up so the lamplight illuminated it. A letter that appears to contain a coded message, with references to pumpkins and newspapers, and what may be a blackmail scheme. The announcement had the desired effect. Conversations paused as attention shifted to Holmes and the mysterious letter in his hand. Even the most reserved of the guests, the quiet librarian from the British Museum, leaned forward slightly, scholarly interest evident in his posture. A coded letter found on a scarecrow pickpocket on Halloween? How perfectly theatrical, Mrs. Forrester exclaimed with delighted disbelief. "Mr. Holmes, one might almost suspect you of arranging this entertainment specifically for the occasion." Holmes's lips curved in a slight smile. "I assure you, Mrs. Forrester, that while I have been known to arrange certain circumstances for investigative purposes, I cannot claim credit for this particular confluence of events. The universe occasionally provides its own mysteries, with timing that even I could not orchestrate. Might we see this letter? Asked the Colonel, professional curiosity evident in his direct gaze. In his years of service, he had doubtless encountered his share of coded communications. Holmes glanced at Lestrade, who gave a small nod of permission. Certainly, though I would ask that it be handled with care. There appear to be multiple layers to this communication, including a message written in invisible ink that becomes faintly visible when held to candlelight. This revelation drew appreciative murmurs from the gathering. Holmes carefully passed the letter to the Colonel, who examined it with military precision before passing it on to Mr. Pembroke, the librarian. The paper itself is quite ordinary, Pembroke observed, holding it carefully by the edges. Widely available at any stationery shop in London, but the ink used for the visible portion has an unusual quality, a slight iridescence that I've seen in certain specialized formulations used for archival documents. Precisely, Holmes agreed, watching with approval as the letter made its way around the circle of guests. It suggests a sender with access to materials beyond those available to the general public. Mycroft, who had been observing the proceedings with quiet attentiveness, shifted slightly in his chair, a movement that would have seemed insignificant to most observers, but which caught his brother's immediate attention. "You have a thought, Mycroft," Holmes prompted. The elder Holmes brother brushed a non-existent crumb from his waistcoat before responding, merely noting that the particular formulation of ink visible on that page is used by a rather specific department of government, a detail that adds another layer to our little mystery. This statement, delivered in Mycroft's characteristically understated manner, nevertheless caused a ripple of heightened interest among the guests. Inspector Lestrade's expression grew more serious, while Watson raised an eyebrow at this new information. "Government connections?" Lestrade asked, his voice lowered, despite the general conversation that had resumed around them as the letter continued its circuit of the room. "Potentially," Mycroft replied, accepting a fresh cup of tea from Mrs. Hudson with a nod of thanks. "Though I wouldn't leap to conclusions. Such materials have been known to circulate beyond their intended users on occasion." The letter completed its journey around the room and returned to Holmes's hands. He held it thoughtfully, turning it to catch the light from different angles. The references to pumpkins initially seemed a seasonal coincidence, but I wonder now if they might serve a more specific purpose in the code. "Perhaps," Watson suggested, warming to the intellectual challenge, "the pumpkins refer to the intended recipients of whatever message is being conveyed. Individuals who are, shall we say, particularly round or orange in appearance." This suggestion drew a soft chuckle from the gathering, releasing some of the tension that had built with Mycroft's hint of government involvement. "An entertaining theory, Watson," Holmes replied with a smile, "though perhaps we should not limit ourselves to the literal interpretation. In many codes, references to seemingly ordinary objects can represent something entirely different, locations, times, or even actions to be taken." Outside, the rain had intensified slightly, drumming a gentle but persistent rhythm against the windows. One of the candles inside a particularly expressive pumpkin guttered briefly in a draught, causing the carved face to seem momentarily animated, as if reacting to the discussion. The mention of newspapers, Pembroke offered, his scholarly mind engaged by the puzzle, suggests a common coding technique where words or letters from published articles are used to construct a message. The recipient would need to have access to the same edition of the newspaper to decipher it. Holmes nodded approvingly. An excellent observation, Mr. Pembroke. The book cipher is indeed one of the more secure methods of encrypted communication, particularly when the key, in this case the specific newspaper and date, is known only to the correspondents. But how would that relate to blackmail? Mrs. Forrester wondered, her natural curiosity overcoming her usual reserve. Surely a blackmailer would want their demands to be clearly understood. Unless, the Colonel interjected thoughtfully, the blackmail itself is not the primary purpose of the communication, but rather a cover for something else entirely. Holmes's eyes brightened at this suggestion. A perceptive point, Colonel. Misdirection is a tool employed not only by magicians, but by those with secrets to protect or agendas to advance. What appears to be a simple blackmail scheme might conceal a more complex purpose. The conversation paused as Mrs. Hudson brought forth a fresh pot of tea and a plate of delicate ginger biscuits that filled the room with a warm, spicy aroma. The momentary break allowed the guests to settle back, considering the puzzle from new angles as they accepted the refreshments. Mycroft, who had been silent during the recent exchanges, cleared his throat softly. "The invisible portion of the text," he said, directing his comment primarily to his brother, "might be revealed more fully with the application of gentle heat. If Mrs. Hudson would not object to the use of her fire—" "Not at all, Mr. Holmes," she replied promptly, "though perhaps a small spirit lamp might be less likely to damage the paper. I believe Mr. Holmes keeps one in his chemical apparatus." "An excellent suggestion," Holmes agreed, rising to retrieve the item in question from his collection of scientific equipment. The small blue flame of the spirit lamp soon cast its own contribution to the room's illumination, a steady, concentrated light that contrasted with the dancing flames of the fire and the warm glow of the pumpkin lanterns. With careful hands, Holmes held the mysterious letter near, but not too near, the heat of the lamp. Slowly, as if emerging from fog, additional words began to appear in the spaces between the original text, revealing themselves in a pale sepia tone that gradually darkened as the heat activated the invisible ink. The guests watched in fascinated silence, the gentle sounds of rain and fire, the only accompaniment to this small but compelling piece of scientific theatre. Even Lestrade, who had witnessed many of Holmes's investigative techniques over the years, leaned forward with undisguised interest. "It's working," Watson murmured, watching over his friend's shoulder as the hidden message gradually became legible. Though the handwriting differs from the visible text, smaller, more precise. "Indeed," Holmes agreed, his attention focused on the emerging words, suggesting two authors, or perhaps one author deliberately disguising their natural hand in the visible portion. The rain outside seemed to intensify in concert with the revealing of the hidden text, its rhythm quickening against the windows, as if nature itself were expressing anticipation. One of the pumpkins on the mantelpiece, the one with the naturally occurring question mark, suddenly emitted a soft hiss as its candle encountered a pocket of moisture in the vegetable flesh, sending a brief plume of scented steam into the air. "How perfectly timed," Mrs. Forrester remarked with a nervous laugh, "almost as if our pumpkin sentinels are participating in the revelation." Holmes continued to carefully expose different portions of the letter to the heat. revealing more of the hidden text with each pass of the lamp. His expression remained composed, but those who knew him well could detect the growing interest in his eyes as the message took shape. "Curious," he murmured finally, setting the lamp aside and studying the now more fully revealed document. The hidden text appears to be a list of dates, locations, and what seem to be reference numbers, possibly to specific newspaper articles or columns. "A schedule of some kind?" Watson suggested. "Perhaps," Holmes agreed, "or a catalogue of previous communications." He glanced at his brother, a silent question in his gaze. Mycroft's expression remained carefully neutral, but he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledgement of something recognized, but not to be openly discussed. The moment of unspoken communication between the brothers was interrupted by a sudden gust of wind that rattled the windows with unexpected force, causing several of the guests to start slightly in surprise. One of the candles in a pumpkin near the window guttered and went out, plunging that corner of the room into deeper shadow. Just the October wind making itself known, Mrs. Hudson reassured everyone, moving to relight the extinguished candle. "They say the veil between worlds grows thin on Halloween, and the spirits become restless." "A poetic notion," Holmes remarked, carefully folding the letter and returning it to his pocket. "Though I find that human actions require far less supernatural explanation than many would prefer to believe. This letter, with its layers of meaning and concealment, speaks to very earthly concerns and ambitions." "Will you decode it tonight, Mr. Holmes?" asked one of the younger guests, clearly captivated by the impromptu mystery. Holmes exchanged a brief glance with Lestrade before responding. "I believe we may make some progress this evening, yes? The Halloween setting seems particularly appropriate for unmasking hidden intentions, does it not?" "Most appropriate," Mycroft agreed, his voice carrying a subtle weight that drew attention despite its measured tone. "Though perhaps we might return to Dr. Watson's excellent selection of ghost stories for a time. This is, after all, a social gathering rather than an investigative consultation." The subtle redirection was masterfully done, and the conversation gradually shifted back to more general topics as Watson selected another volume from his collection. The mystery of the pumpkin papers remained present in the room, however, an intellectual current flowing beneath the surface of the Halloween festivities, occasionally rising to awareness in thoughtful glances or pauses in conversation. Outside, the rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows, while inside, the carved pumpkins maintained their silent watch over the gathering, their candlelit expressions somehow knowing in the warm glow of 281B Baker Street. The evening had found its perfect balance of mystery and comfort, of questions posed but not yet answered, of Halloween enchantment blended with the very real puzzle contained in a scarecrow pickpocket's hidden letter. Watson's second ghost story, a tale of a traveller who repeatedly encounters the same mysterious figure at different crossroads throughout his journey, had drawn the gathering at 221B Baker Street into that perfect state of attentive stillness that marks truly effective storytelling. As his measured voice delivered the final lines, a comfortable silence settled over the room, disturbed only by the gentle crackle of the fire and the persistent rhythm of rain against the windows. "Beautifully told, Dr. Watson," Mrs. Forrester said finally, her voice soft with appreciation. "You have a remarkable gift for bringing such tales to life." Watson acknowledged the compliment with a modest nod. The story does most of the work, Mrs. Forrester. I merely serve as its temporary voice." "Nevertheless," Mycroft observed, "delivery matters a great deal in these cases. The same words, read without your sense of pacing and emphasis, would not have created quite the same atmosphere." The gathering murmured agreement as Mrs. Hudson rose to tend to the fire, adding another log that sent a shower of golden sparks up the chimney. The brief flare of light caused the shadows cast by the glowing pumpkins to dance momentarily across the walls, a silent, flickering ballet that seemed to celebrate the evening's blend of mystery and comfort. "Speaking of atmosphere," Mrs. Hudson said as she returned to her seat, "I believe it might be time to introduce some traditional Halloween games. My cousin writes that they're an essential part of the celebration in America." This suggestion was met with general enthusiasm, particularly from the younger guests who had been quietly hoping for some form of entertainment beyond conversation and storytelling, excellent though both had been. "What sort of games did your cousin describe, Mrs. Hudson?" asked the young wife of the American returned couple, her expression brightening with interest. "Several, that sound quite charming," Mrs. Hudson replied, pleased by the response. "Bobbing for apples is apparently a favourite, though I've taken the liberty of adapting it slightly to be less damp. And there's a lovely tradition of roasting nuts in the fire to divine one's future." Holmes, who had been seemingly lost in thought, no doubt contemplating the mystery of the pumpkin papers, looked up at this with a raised eyebrow. "Divination through heated legumes. A curious method of forecasting." "It's all in good fun, Mr. Holmes," Mrs. Hudson replied with an indulgent smile. "The nuts are placed in pairs on the hearth, each representing a potential couple. If they burn quietly side by side, it foretells a harmonious match. If they jump apart or crack noisily, the match is ill-fated." "Ah," Holmes nodded, his expression suggesting that he found the logic of this system less than compelling, but was willing to indulge the tradition for the sake of the gathering. Mrs. Hudson had clearly prepared thoroughly for her Halloween party. From a cabinet, she produced a shallow copper basin filled with water, in which floated a dozen perfect red apples, their polished skins gleaming in the firelight. Rather than requiring guests to capture the apples with their teeth, the traditional method that Holmes had clearly found questionable, she provided small, ornate fruit forks. "The challenge," she explained, "is to spear your apple successfully without touching the sides of the basin or using your other hand for balance. Much more refined than the original version, I think you'll agree." The game proved surprisingly challenging and entertaining. The slippery apples rotated away from direct approaches, requiring strategy and patience. The Colonel, with his steady military bearing, was the first to succeed, drawing appreciative applause as he triumphantly lifted his skewered apple from the water without a single ripple disturbing the surface. "Well done, Colonel," Holmes commended. A demonstration of tactical thinking applied to the domestic sphere. As the apple spearing continued, with varying degrees of success and much good-natured laughter, Holmes found himself drawn once again to the mysterious letter in his pocket. While the festivities progressed around him, he withdrew slightly into the window alcove, using the moment of general distraction to study the document more closely in the combined light of a nearby lamp and the occasional flash of distant lightning that had begun to accompany the rainfall. He was not as removed from the gathering as he might have believed, however. Mycroft's observant gaze noted his brother's withdrawal, as did Watson's, though neither made any move to interrupt his contemplation. "Mr. Holmes seems deep in thought," Mrs. Forrester remarked to Watson as she waited her turn at the apple basin. "Is he solving the mystery, even in the midst of our games?" Watson smiled, watching his friend's familiar profile against the rain-streaked window. "Holmes's mind rarely rests, Mrs. Forrester. It's entirely possible that what appears to us as distraction is actually the most intense form of engagement with the puzzle." Across the room, Lestrade was engaged in conversation with Mr. Pembroke, the librarian, their heads inclined toward each other as they discussed something with evident interest. The inspector occasionally glanced toward Holmes, clearly wondering what progress was being made with the curious letter. The apple game concluded with Mrs. Hudson herself claiming the final success, much to the delight of her guests. As the empty basin was removed, she introduced the next tradition, the roasting of nuts on the hearth. "Now," she explained, distributing pairs of hazelnuts to those interested, "each nut represents a person. You place them side by side on the hearth and observe their behavior as they roast." This activity drew the gathering closer to the fire, where they knelt or crouched in a semicircle, the warm glow illuminating their faces as they placed their nuts carefully on the hot stones. The sound of occasional soft pops and the warm, earthy aroma of roasting hazelnuts added new sensory dimensions to the evening's experience. "Look at that pair," the colonel's wife exclaimed, pointing to two nuts that were rotating slowly toward each other as they heated. "A perfect match, according to tradition." While these two, Mr. Forrester observed with a chuckle, indicating another pair that had skittered dramatically in opposite directions, seem decidedly incompatible. The simple divination game provoked much amusement and speculation, with guests assigning names to their nuts and creating elaborate narratives based on the movements of the heating shells. Even Mycroft, who rarely engaged in what he might consider frivolous activities, placed a pair on the hearth with deliberate precision, watching their behavior with the same focused attention he might give to an international diplomatic crisis. Holmes, drawn by the laughter and exclamations, finally emerged from his contemplation by the window and rejoined the group. His expression suggested that his time apart had been productive. There was a clarity in his eyes that Watson recognized as the look of a man who has found a promising path through a puzzle. "You've had a thought about our mysterious letter?" Watson said quietly, as Holmes took a position beside him, near the fire. "Several, in fact," Holmes replied, his voice equally low. "The references to newspapers have particular significance, I believe. Tell me, Watson, do we still have yesterday's Times in the sitting room? And perhaps editions from earlier this week as well?" Watson considered for a moment, mentally cataloguing the usual drift of newspapers that accumulated in their shared spaces. "I believe so, yes. Mrs. Hudson hasn't cleared them away yet, given her focus on preparing for this evening's gathering." "Excellent." Holmes's gaze moved to the pumpkin lanterns, their carved faces now casting long shadows as some of their internal candles began to burn low. "I find myself wondering if our carved guardians might provide more illumination than we initially suspected." Before Watson could question this cryptic statement, Mrs. Hudson announced the final Halloween tradition of the evening, a storytelling game where each guest would contribute a portion of a tale, building upon what had come before. "We'll need something to mark the transitions between storytellers," she said, looking around the room. "Ah, perfect." She picked up a small decorative gourd that had been part of the autumn display on the side table. When you receive this, you'll continue the story for a minute or so, then pass it to the next person. The game began with Mrs. Hudson herself, who set the scene with practiced skill. On a night much like this one, with rain tapping against the windows and shadows dancing on the walls, a lone traveller sought shelter in a house that seemed oddly familiar, though he was certain he had never visited it before. As the gourd passed from hand to hand, the collaborative story grew in unexpected directions, sometimes humorous, sometimes mysterious, but always maintaining that perfect Halloween balance between the comfortable and the uncanny. The Colonel added military precision to an encounter with footsteps on a staircase. Mr. Pembroke contributed scholarly details about an ancient artifact found in the house's library, and Mrs. Forrester introduced a ghostly figure glimpsed in a mirror that might or might not have been a trick of the light. When the gourd reached Mycroft, he accepted it with surprising willingness, adding a layer of geopolitical intrigue to the tale that somehow managed to remain perfectly in keeping with the established narrative. His contribution, delivered in measured tones that nevertheless commanded complete attention, suggested depths of storytelling ability that few might have suspected in the usually reserved government official. Holmes, when his turn came, introduced a careful observer who noted that the ghostly encounters followed a pattern related to the phases of the moon and the positioning of certain objects within the mysterious house. His addition was both perfectly in keeping with the ghost story framework and a sly reference to his own methods of deduction. As the story continued its circuit around the room, Holmes caught Watson's eye and made a small, subtle gesture toward the newspapers. Watson, understanding immediately, gave a nearly imperceptible nod. When next he rose to accept a fresh cup of tea from Mrs. Hudson, he casually collected several folded newspapers from the side table, placing them on the desk near Holmes's chemical apparatus, as if merely tidying the space. The collaborative story reached its conclusion with Lestrade, who surprised everyone with a deftly crafted resolution that tied together the various elements into a satisfying whole, a testament to the detective's often overlooked narrative skills, honed through years of writing police reports that needed to be both comprehensive and compelling. "Bravo, Inspector," Holmes said with genuine appreciation as the story concluded. "You've demonstrated that Scotland Yard harbours literary talent alongside its investigative capabilities." Lestrade accepted the compliment with a pleased nod, though his expression suggested he was more accustomed to Holmes's criticism than his praise. As the evening progressed, Holmes gradually made his way to the desk where Watson had placed the newspapers. His movements were casual, seemingly part of the natural flow of the gathering, but those who knew him well recognized the deliberate nature of his positioning. Mycroft, engaged in conversation with the Colonel about recent developments in British shipping regulations, a surprisingly animated discussion given the technical nature of the subject, nevertheless managed to keep his brother within his peripheral vision. When Holmes began to systematically examine the newspapers, comparing certain sections to the mysterious letter he had once again withdrawn from his pocket, Mycroft subtly positioned himself to shield this activity from the general notice of the guests. Watson, understanding the brothers' unspoken coordination, took it upon himself to assist Mrs. Hudson in distributing another round of Mycroft's exquisite pastries, ensuring that the gathering's attention remained pleasantly diverted. Outside, the storm had intensified somewhat, with occasional rumbles of thunder providing a dramatic counterpoint to the comfortable scene within. The carved pumpkins seemed to respond to each thunderclap with brief flares of increased illumination, as if startled by the sound, an effect caused by drafts from the old window frames, but enchanting nonetheless. Holmes, now fully engaged in his examination of the newspapers, had spread several editions across the desk and was making small annotations on a separate sheet of paper. His focused concentration was the same, whether he worked in the solitude of an empty room or, as now, in the midst of a social gathering, a quality that had often amazed Watson over the years of their friendship. "He's found something," Lestrade murmured, having made his way to Watson's side while ostensibly admiring one of the more elaborate pumpkin carvings. "I recognize that look." "Indeed," Watson agreed quietly, "though whether it will lead to a resolution this evening or merely deepen the mystery remains to be seen." The inspector nodded, his expression suggesting that either outcome would be acceptable on this particular night. There was something about the combination of Halloween atmosphere, good company, and intellectual challenge that made even an unresolved puzzle seem appropriate. "Dr. Watson," Mrs. Hudson called from across the room, "would you favor us with one more ghost story before the evening grows too late? Your reading of the last one was so wonderfully atmospheric." Watson, ever obliging, moved toward his collection of books. "I'd be delighted, Mrs. Hudson. I believe I have just the tale for the current mood, short enough not to keep anyone too late, but with just the right blend of mystery and resolution." As Watson selected his final reading of the evening, Holmes looked up briefly from his work, his expression suggesting that he too had found the perfect blend of mystery and resolution. With a small nod to Mycroft, who returned the gesture with equal subtlety, Holmes gathered his notes and the newspapers into a more organized arrangement, clearly having reached some conclusion about the coded references in the mysterious letter. The carved pumpkins, their candles now burning lower but still casting that distinctive warm glow throughout the room, seemed to watch these developments with their flickering eyes, silent witnesses to both the spoken ghost stories and the unspoken mystery gradually being unravelled in their midst. Watson's final ghost story, a tale of an ancient country house, where portraits were said to change their expressions when no one was looking directly at them, had drawn the gathering at 220 Ormwood's Baker Street into a perfect state of attentive silence. His voice, warm and measured, filled the room with images of long corridors lined with watchful painted eyes and the gentle suspense of things glimpsed only in peripheral vision. As he turned the final page and delivered the last words, where the narrator discovers that his own likeness has somehow appeared in a previously empty frame, a comfortable shiver seemed to pass through the assembled guests. The silence that followed was appreciative, rather than awkward, a moment of shared experience before the spell of storytelling gently dissolved. "Marvellous, Dr. Watson," Mrs. Forrester said finally, her voice soft with genuine admiration. "You've quite convinced me never to visit an ancestral home with a portrait gallery again." Gentle laughter rippled through the room as conversation gradually resumed, the guests discussing their favourite elements of the story or sharing similar tales they had encountered. The carved pumpkins glowed with steady amber light, their expressions seeming more knowing now, as if they too had been affected by Watson's narrative skills. Holmes, who who had been dividing his attention between the story and his examination of the newspapers, now rose from his position at the desk. There was a subtle but unmistakable air of satisfaction about him, the quiet confidence of a man who has found the path through a labyrinth. "I believe," he said, his voice pitched to carry just enough to gradually draw the attention of the gathering, "that our Halloween evening might be enhanced by another sort of mystery, one that unfolds before us rather than from the pages of a book." This pronouncement was met with intrigued murmurs and expectant glances. Lestrade straightened in his chair, clearly wondering what conclusions Holmes had drawn from his examination of the mysterious letter and the newspapers. "Are you referring to the Scarecrow's letter, Mr. Holmes?" asked Colonel Winters, his military bearing somehow more pronounced as he leaned forward with interest. "Indeed I am, Colonel," Holmes replied. "With Inspector Lestrade's permission, I propose a small experiment in collaborative deduction, a Halloween game of sorts, but with a genuine mystery at its heart." Lestrade gave a slightly hesitant nod. "I suppose there's no harm in it, Mr. Holmes. The coded nature of the letter means it's unlikely to contain anything inappropriate for the present company." "Precisely," Holmes agreed, "and multiple perspectives may reveal connections that might otherwise remain obscure." He moved to the center of the room, where the light from the fire and the glowing pumpkins created a warm, expectant atmosphere. "Mrs. Hudson, might I trouble you for a few additional candles? Our pumpkin sentinels provide excellent ambience, but I believe we'll need more focused illumination for this particular endeavor." "Of course, Mr. Holmes." Mrs. Hudson rose efficiently, bringing forth a collection of slender candles in silver holders that she arranged on the large central table, which had been cleared after the earlier refreshments. The new lights created pools of golden illumination against the polished wood surface, perfect for the examination of documents. "Now," Holmes continued, carefully spreading the newspapers he had been studying across the table, "what we have here is a letter that contains multiple layers of information, visible text that appears to be encoded, and hidden text revealed by heat that provides dates, locations, and reference numbers." He placed the letter itself in the center of the table, now fully visible to all the guests who had drawn closer with undisguised curiosity. In the candlelight, both the original writing and the heat-revealed secondary text were clearly distinguishable. Two separate communications overlaid on a single page. "My examination of the newspapers from the past week," Holmes explained, gesturing to the spread of publications, "suggests that our mysterious correspondent is using what is commonly called a book cipher, except in this case the book is actually a newspaper." "Ingenious," Mycroft commented from his position slightly behind the others, his bulk somehow managing to appear weightless as he leaned forward with interest. "The newspaper as cipher key is particularly effective because it is both widely available and ephemeral. Yesterday's edition is fish wrapping tomorrow, making the code both accessible to its intended recipient and difficult to crack after the fact." Holmes nodded in acknowledgement of his brother's observation. "Precisely, Mycroft. The dates revealed in the invisible portion of the text appear to refer to specific newspaper editions, while the numbers likely indicate page, column, and word position." Mr. Pembroke, the librarian, adjusted his spectacles as he studied the arrangement of papers. "A variation on the Beale cipher, then. Fascinating, and particularly appropriate for Halloween Thomas Beale himself disappeared mysteriously, leaving his famous ciphers unsolved to this day. A scholarly connection I hadn't considered, Mr. Pembroke, but most appropriate indeed, Holmes agreed. Now, shall we attempt to decode a portion of the message together? I suggest we begin with the first sequence indicated in the hidden text, October 27th, page 4, column 3, words 7, 12, 19, and 22. The gathering arranged themselves around the table, drawn into this unexpected intellectual adventure. Even those guests who might normally have been intimidated by such an exercise found themselves caught up in the collaborative spirit of the endeavour. "Here," said the Colonel, who had already located the appropriate edition and turned to page 4. Column 3 is an article about the autumn flower show at the Royal Horticultural Society. "Excellent, Colonel," Holmes commended. "Now, if you would be so kind as to count down to the specified words." Working together, with Holmes gently guiding their efforts, the group began to extract words from the newspaper articles according to the pattern indicated in the hidden text. The process was methodical, but engaging, with different guests taking responsibility for different portions of the newspapers. Mrs. Hudson kept the candles trimmed to provide the best possible light, while Lestrade made notes of the words as they were identified. "The 7th word is meeting," the Colonel announced, his finger carefully marking the position in the column. "And the 12th is shipment," added Mrs. Forrester, who had been counting alongside him. "19th is arriving," Mr. Pembroke contributed. "And 22nd is tomorrow," completed the Colonel's wife. Holmes nodded with satisfaction as Lestrade noted down these first 4 words. "Excellent progress. Now for the next sequence. October 28th, page 2, column 1, words 15, 16, 23, and 29. The relevant newspaper was passed to Watson, who located the specified column, an article discussing recent developments in transatlantic shipping. Word 15 is at, 16 is the, 23 is south, and 29 is warehouse. So thus far we have meeting shipment arriving tomorrow at the South Warehouse. Lestrade read from his notes. Sounds like fairly straightforward instructions for a rendezvous. Indeed, Holmes agreed, though I suspect the complete message will reveal more specific details, and perhaps the nature of the shipment in question. He guided them through several more sequences, each revealing additional words that gradually formed a more complete message. As the decoding continued, the storm outside intensified briefly, a strong gust of wind driving rain against the windows with sudden force. The sound momentarily drew all eyes toward the glass, where the reflection of the room, warm with candlelight and alive with intellectual engagement, stood in stark contrast to the wild autumn night beyond. Nature provides dramatic emphasis, Holmes observed with a slight smile, before returning their attention to the task at hand. The next sequence, if you would be so kind. The collaborative decoding continued, the message gradually taking shape, word by word. The candles burned lower, their light becoming more intimate as the wax columns diminished. The carved pumpkins, too, showed signs of the advancing hour, some of their internal flames now flickering as they neared the end of their fuel, creating an ever-changing pattern of shadows that danced across the walls and ceiling of 221B Baker Street. Eastern Imports marked with red seal, Watson read, as another section of the message was completed. This is beginning to sound rather more specific than a simple meeting arrangement. And potentially more significant, Mycroft remarked, his voice neutral, but his expression suggesting deeper considerations. Red seals are used by several diplomatic entities for official communications and certain types of trade documentation. Holmes nodded slightly at his brother's observation, but did not elaborate, instead directing the group to the next sequence in the cipher. The work continued, the steady rhythm of page-turning, word-counting, and note-making creating its own gentle cadence in the room. Outside, the storm began to subside, the rain softening to a gentle patter that formed a soothing background to their efforts. One of the pumpkins on the mantelpiece, the one with the naturally occurring question mark that Holmes had noticed earlier, suddenly emitted a soft hiss as its candle finally reached a pocket of moisture in the vegetable flesh. The sound drew attention just as the flame flared briefly, causing the carved question mark to stand out in dramatic relief before the light subsided again. Even our pumpkin guardians are participating in the mystery, Mrs. Hudson remarked with a smile, rising to replace the guttering candle with a fresh one. I wouldn't be surprised if they've been listening to every word. This whimsical observation brought a moment of light relief to the focused group before they returned to their decoding efforts. Holmes, watching the proceedings with quiet satisfaction, occasionally offered guidance when the pattern became less clear, or when the specified newspaper column presented particular challenges in word identification. This next section references the Morning Post rather than the Times, he noted, as they approached a new sequence. Fortunately, I believe we have Tuesday's edition among our collection. Indeed they did, and the decoding continued with barely a pause, the group now working with practiced coordination. The complete message was gradually taking form, a set of instructions regarding a shipment arriving from the east, directions for its handling and distribution, and references to individuals identified only by initials or code names. B will provide documentation through usual channels, Lestrade read from the accumulated notes. That suggests an ongoing operation rather than a one-time transaction. Precisely, Holmes agreed. And the reference to quarterly arrangements continuing as established further supports that conclusion. As the decoded message neared completion, the atmosphere in the room had transformed from that of a social gathering to something more akin to an informal investigative council. The guests, regardless of their backgrounds or usual interests, had become fully engaged in the intellectual puzzle, each contributing according to their abilities. The Colonel's methodical precision, Mr. Pembroke's scholarly attention to detail, Mrs. Forrester's quick eye for patterns, and even the younger guest's enthusiasm for the treasure hunt aspect of the exercise. I believe, Holmes said as the final sequence was decoded, that we have now extracted the complete message hidden within our scarecrow's curious communication. Lestrade reviewed his notes, arranging them in proper sequence before reading aloud. Meeting shipment arriving tomorrow at the South Warehouse near London Bridge. Eastern imports marked with red seals require immediate processing. J will oversee distribution to usual addresses. Collection proceeds to be delivered to K by Thursday evening without fail. Documentation will be handled through established channels. B will provide necessary clearances. Quarterly arrangements continued as established, with additional provisions for a new northern route. Exercise usual caution regarding customs officials. Next communication through alternate channel. A thoughtful silence followed this reading, each person considering the implications of the decoded message. It was Mycroft who finally broke the silence, his tone conversational, but with an underlying note of authority. A smuggling operation, clearly, he observed, reasonably sophisticated in its organization, with established roles and procedures. The reference to customs officials is particularly telling. But smuggling what, exactly? Watson wondered. The message is frustratingly non-specific about the nature of the Eastern imports. Deliberately so, I imagine, Holmes replied. However, the reference to a red seal may be more informative than it initially appears. He glanced at his brother, a silent question in his eyes. Mycroft gave an almost imperceptible nod before responding. There are certain luxury goods from China and Japan that bear red seal markings, particularly high-grade teas, silks, and porcelains. Many of these items carry substantial import duties. So our scarecrow pickpocket was part of a smuggling ring, bringing in luxury goods to avoid customs duties, Lestrade summarized, his expression suggesting he found this somewhat anticlimactic. Hardly seems worth the elaborate encryption, Mr. Holmes. Perhaps, Holmes acknowledged, though the scale and organization suggested by the message indicates a substantial operation, one that might well justify such precautions. And there is the question of why a simple courier would be disguised as a scarecrow on Halloween of all things. This observation redirected the group's attention to the seasonal aspect of the mystery, a dimension that had been temporarily overshadowed by the technical process of decoding. The disguise might have been merely opportunistic, the Colonel suggested. Halloween provides a convenient occasion when unusual attire would attract less attention. Or perhaps, Mr. Pembroke offered, his scholarly mind evidently considering multiple possibilities. The choice was more deliberate. The scarecrow, as a traditional guardian of fields and crops, symbolically protecting their illicit harvest from discovery. Holmes nodded approvingly at this interpretation. A literary connection that has merit, Mr. Pembroke. The symbolism would not be lost on an organization that demonstrates considerable sophistication in its communications. The candlelight flickered across the table, illuminating the spread of newspapers, the mysterious letter, and the notes containing the decoded message. Outside, the storm had subsided entirely, leaving only the gentle aftermath of rain, droplets sliding down the window panes and dripping from the eaves with a soft, rhythmic patter. One by one, the candles inside the carved pumpkins had begun to expire, their lights winking out as they consumed the last of their fuel. Only the one with the question mark continued to burn steadily, its flame casting the symbolic shape across the wall in elongated form. "Well," Mrs. Hudson said finally, breaking the contemplative silence that had settled over the group, "this has certainly been the most unusual Halloween party I've ever hosted. Mystery, deduction, and ghost stories. My cousin in America will scarcely believe my account." This comment lightened the mood considerably, drawing smiles and murmurs of agreement from the gathering. The intellectual exercise had been engaging, but the hour had grown late, and the natural conclusion of their Halloween celebration was approaching. "I believe," Holmes said, gathering the decoded notes and handing them to Lestrade, "that Scotland Yard now has sufficient information to intercept tomorrow's shipment, and perhaps unravel this smuggling operation entirely." Lestrade accepted the notes with a nod of acknowledgement. "Indeed, Mr. Holmes, I'll have men in position at London Bridge well before the appointed time." He paused, then added with genuine appreciation, "This has been most educational. I don't often have the opportunity to observe your methods so directly. let alone participate in them. "The credit belongs to our entire company," Holmes replied with unusual generosity. "Each person contributed to the unravelling of the cipher in their own way, a collaborative deduction that proved more efficient than my solitary efforts might have been." This gracious acknowledgment brought a warm conclusion to the evening's investigative activities. As if responding to a subtle cue, Mrs. Hudson rose to offer final refreshments, the last of Mycroft's exquisite pastries and a special spiced cider she had prepared for the occasion. The gathering gradually returned to more conventional social interactions, though the shared experience of the decoding exercise had created a unique bond among the participants. Conversations now flowed with increased familiarity, peppered with gentle humour and references to their collective achievement. Outside, the clouds had begun to part, revealing glimpses of stars in the clearing sky. The last hours of Halloween night spread over London like a gentle blanket, cool, damp, and somehow cleansed by the recent rainfall. Within 220B Baker Street, the final pumpkin candle, the one illuminating the question mark, flickered briefly before steadying again, as if determined to maintain its watch until the last guest departed, and the unusual Halloween gathering came to its natural conclusion. As the evening deepened toward midnight, the Halloween gathering at 221B Baker Street had taken on that particular quality of warmth that comes only from a shared experience. The excitement of collaboratively decoding the mysterious message had created a gentle bond among the guests, who now conversed with the easy familiarity of old acquaintances, rather than people who had, in most cases, met only hours before. Mrs. Hudson's spiced cider, a careful blend of apple, cinnamon, clove, and other autumn spices that she declined to specify despite several inquiries, had been received with universal appreciation. Steam rose from the delicate porcelain cups in which she served it, adding another layer to the sensory tapestry of the evening. The amber liquid caught the light of the remaining candles, glowing with inner warmth that matched the atmosphere of the gathering. "I must say, Mrs. Hudson," Mycroft remarked, as he accepted a second cup with uncharacteristic indulgence, "this particular concoction would not be out of place at certain diplomatic functions, where I have had the dubious pleasure of sampling beverages from across the empire. Its complexity is most satisfactory." Coming from Mycroft Holmes, this constituted effusive praise. Mrs. Hudson acknowledged it with a pleased nod before moving to offer the cider to her other guests. The final pumpkin candle, the one illuminating the question mark shape, continued its steady burn, now the sole survivor among its carved companions. Its light cast elongated shadows across the room, stretching the familiar contours of 221B into more mysterious dimensions. Holmes, who had been engaged in quiet conversation with Lestrade near the fireplace, now moved toward the centre of the room. There was something in his expression, a subtle anticipation that Watson recognized from countless previous cases, suggesting that the evening's mystery had not yet revealed all its secrets. "Ladies and gentlemen," Holmes addressed the gathering, his voice pitched to carry without effort, "while I believe we have successfully decoded the primary message hidden within our scarecrow's curious letter, I find myself wondering about one particular aspect that seems unresolved." This pronouncement drew the immediate attention of the guests, who settled into attentive silence, many still holding their cups of spiced cider as they turned toward Holmes with renewed interest. "To what aspect do you refer, Mr. Holmes?" asked the Colonel, his military bearing somehow more pronounced as he straightened in his chair. "The seasonal connection," Holmes replied, gesturing toward the spent pumpkins, whose carved faces now sat in darkness, save for the lone question mark still illuminated on the mantelpiece. Our mysterious correspondent chose Halloween as the day for this communication to be delivered. The courier was disguised specifically as a scarecrow, a figure associated with harvest and autumn. And most curiously of all, the letter itself contained multiple references to pumpkins, yet our decoded message made no mention of them whatsoever. This observation sparked murmurs of interest among the guests. It was true. The decoded instructions about the smuggling operation had contained no reference to pumpkins, despite their prominence in the original encrypted text. I had assumed the pumpkin references were merely seasonal camouflage, Lestrade admitted, a way to make the letter appear innocuous if it were intercepted. "A reasonable assumption, Inspector," Holmes acknowledged. "But there is a principle in cryptography that wasteful elements are rarely included without purpose. Every word in a coded message typically serves a function, particularly in a system as carefully constructed as this one." Mycroft, who had been listening with half-lidded eyes that nevertheless missed nothing, now shifted slightly in his chair. "You believe the pumpkin references constitute a secondary layer of the code," he stated, rather than asked. "Precisely," Holmes confirmed, with a nod of appreciation for his brother's perspicacity. "A code within a code, as it were. And I believe the key to this secondary layer may be found not in the newspapers, but in something more immediately present." Holmes's gaze moved deliberately to the lone illuminated pumpkin, the one with the natural question mark pattern that had caught his attention earlier in the evening. The gathered company followed his line of sight, many seeing the distinctive marking for the first time, as their attention had been primarily on the carved faces rather than the natural patterns of the pumpkins. "Mrs. Hudson," Holmes asked, "might I trouble you for the origin of this particular specimen? It has the most unusual marking." "That one was part of a special selection from the market at Covent Garden," she replied. "The vendor mentioned they were from a farm in Kent, known for growing unusually patterned varieties. I was particularly drawn to that one because of the curious question mark. It seemed appropriate for your household, Mr. Holmes." "Indeed it was, Mrs. Hudson, perhaps more so than either of us realized." Holmes approached the mantelpiece, carefully lifting the still-lit pumpkin and bringing it to the central table. The candle inside flickered, but held steady, casting its warm glow across the polished surface. "Observe the pattern. A near-perfect question mark formed naturally in the pumpkin's skin. Nature rarely produces such precise geometric shapes without some form of intervention." The guests gathered closer, examining the pumpkin with renewed interest. The question mark pattern was, indeed, remarkably defined, a darker green curve against the orange background, with a distinct dot beneath it. "Are you suggesting," Watson asked, "that this pattern was deliberately created during the pumpkin's growth?" "It is possible to influence the patterning of certain gourds and pumpkins through controlled exposure to sunlight and strategic placement of stencils or masks during development," Holmes explained. "A practice more common than one might expect among specialized growers." Mr. Pembroke, the librarian, nodded in confirmation. "There are documented cases of Japanese farmers growing watermelons in square molds to create cubic fruits. The principle would be similar." Precisely, Mr. Pembroke, Holmes agreed. Now, consider the references to pumpkins in the encrypted letter. There were exactly 7 such references, each describing pumpkins with specific patterns or markings. Holmes returned to the desk where the decoded notes and the original letter still lay. With careful fingers, he extracted a separate sheet of paper, on which he had apparently made additional notes during his earlier examination. The letter mentioned, and I quote, "spotted pumpkins from the eastern field, striped pumpkins with green bands, star-patterned specimens from the north corner, crescent-marked varieties near the stone wall, speckled orange beauties by the oak, ring-patterned gourds from the western patch, and finally question-marked curiosities from the central garden." As Holmes read this list, a new understanding seemed to dawn across the faces of the gathered company. It was Mycroft who verbalized the collective realization. "A map," he said simply. "The pumpkin descriptions form a map of drop locations or meeting points." "Exactly so," Holmes confirmed, his expression reflecting quiet satisfaction. "Each patterned pumpkin represents a specific location, likely within the grounds of a country estate or large farm, where these distinctive varieties are grown. The eastern field, north corner, stone wall, and so forth provide additional geographic precision." Lestrade leaned forward, professional interest thoroughly engaged, despite the late hour. "And the question-marked curiosities from the central garden would indicate—" "The central control point of the operation," Holmes completed. "The location from which instructions are issued and to which reports are returned. The headquarters, as it were, of our smuggling enterprise." The lone candle inside the question-marked pumpkin flickered momentarily, causing the shadow of the pattern to dance across the table in a way that seemed almost animated, as if acknowledging its role in the unfolding mystery. "Remarkable," the Colonel commented, examining the pumpkin with newfound respect. "A coded map, hidden within descriptions of decorative gourds. One would need to be familiar with both the encrypted message and the actual location to make proper use of it. Which explains why our scarecrow courier was carrying the physical pumpkin as well," Holmes added, producing a small surprise among the gathering. "Was he?" Watson asked, puzzled. "I don't recall mention of that in Lestrade's account of the arrest." "Because it wasn't immediately recognized as significant," Holmes explained. "Inspector, you mentioned that the pickpocket was disguised as a scarecrow, but you didn't specify the complete nature of his costume. Am I correct in assuming that he was carrying a pumpkin as part of his Halloween disguise?" Lestrade's expression shifted from confusion to sudden comprehension. "Yes, he was. A small pumpkin with some sort of natural marking on it. We assumed it was simply part of his costume. A common enough Halloween accessory. It's currently in the evidence room at Scotland Yard." "I would be most interested in examining that pumpkin," Holmes remarked. "I strongly suspect it bears a question mark pattern similar to this one, serving as both a recognition signal to his contact and a physical key to the locations described in the letter." The revelation brought a collective murmur of appreciation from the gathering. The layered nature of the mystery, a coded message hidden within a cipher, and a physical map disguised as seasonal decoration, spoke to a level of sophistication that elevated what might have seemed a simple smuggling operation into something more intriguing. "You know," Watson observed, "there's something almost poetic about using pumpkins as the key to this particular code. These vegetables have a long association with mystery and transformation, from ancient harvest rituals to the modern jack-o'-lantern traditions we've been enjoying tonight. A perceptive observation, Watson, Holmes acknowledged. Our mysterious correspondents have demonstrated not only technical skill in encryption, but a certain artistic flair in their choice of medium. One almost admires the ingenuity, despite its application to illegal purposes. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed midnight, the traditional hour when Halloween ended and All Saints' Day began. The sound drew attention to the lateness of the hour, and several of the guests exchanged glances that suggested the evening was drawing naturally to its close. Mycroft was the first to acknowledge this reality, rising from his chair with a grace that belied his substantial frame. "A most enlightening evening, Mrs. Hudson," he said, inclining his head toward their hostess. "Your Halloween gathering has provided intellectual stimulation well beyond my expectations, which were, I assure you, already considerable, given the company." This signal from Mycroft seemed to release the other guests to begin their own preparations for departure. There were murmurs of appreciation directed toward Mrs. Hudson, expressions of delight at having participated in the unravelling of a genuine mystery, and the usual social niceties that accompany the conclusion of a successful gathering. As the guests began to collect their coats and exchange final observations about the evening, Holmes drew Lestrade aside for a brief, quiet conversation. Their heads inclined toward each other, Holmes appeared to be giving additional instructions or insights regarding the smuggling operation that would be intercepted the following day. Lestrade nodded with serious attention, occasionally asking a clarifying question that Holmes answered with precise detail. Watson, observing this exchange while assisting Mrs. Hudson in gathering empty cups and plates, recognized the familiar pattern of a case's conclusion. Holmes ensuring that official justice would be properly served, while maintaining his own distance from the public recognition that would inevitably follow. As the last of the guests made their way down the 17 steps to the street below, where hansoms waited to carry them through the now clear autumn night, 221B Baker Street gradually returned to its more familiar state. The decorations remained, the spent pumpkins, the autumn leaves along the mantelpiece, the lingering scent of spices and candle wax, but the space had transformed back from festive gathering place to private sanctuary. Only Holmes, Watson, Mrs. Hudson, and Mycroft remained, the latter having indicated with a subtle gesture to his brother that he wished to speak privately before departing. Lestrade had left with the other guests, eager to begin preparations for the operation that would intercept the smuggled goods at London Bridge the following day. "A most productive evening, brother mine," Mycroft remarked as he accepted a final cup of tea from Mrs. Hudson, a ritual nightcap rather than further refreshment. "Though I find myself wondering about certain aspects of this smuggling operation that seem curiously familiar." Holmes, who had returned to examining the question-marked pumpkin in the now quieter room, looked up with a raised eyebrow. "Familiar in what sense, Mycroft?" "The organizational structure, the use of multiple layers of encryption, the particular reference to Eastern imports with red seals." Mycroft sipped his tea with deliberate calm before continuing. "There are certain parallels to another operation that came to the attention of my department some months ago, an operation we believed had been discontinued." This exchange, though conducted in conversational tones, carried an undercurrent that Watson had learned to recognize over the years, The brothers were communicating on multiple levels, with certain implications understood rather than stated directly. "Indeed?" Holmes replied, his expression thoughtful. "Perhaps tomorrow's interception will provide clarity on whether these parallels are coincidental or indicative of a common source." Mycroft nodded, setting down his empty teacup with characteristic precision. "Perhaps so. I would be most interested in your observations following that event, particularly regarding any documentation that might be recovered." "I shall make a point of examining it personally," Holmes assured him. With this cryptic exchange apparently concluded to his satisfaction, Mycroft rose to take his leave. He thanked Mrs. Hudson once more for her hospitality, nodded to Watson with genuine warmth, and shared a final, meaningful glance with his brother before descending the stairs with measured steps. As the sound of Mycroft's departure faded, Mrs. Hudson surveyed the aftermath of her Halloween gathering, with hands planted firmly on her hips. "Well, gentlemen, I believe we can consider the evening a success. My first American Halloween celebration, complete with a mystery worthy of Mr. Holmes himself. My cousin will hardly believe my account." "It was splendid, Mrs. Hudson," Watson assured her warmly. "A perfect balance of tradition, sociability, and unexpected adventure." "Indeed," Holmes agreed, his attention still partly focused on the question-marked pumpkin. "Though I suspect we have not yet seen the final act of this particular mystery." "Which can wait until tomorrow," Mrs. Hudson declared firmly. "Even mysterious scarecrows and smuggled goods must respect decent hours." With that practical observation, she bid them good night and descended to her own quarters, leaving Holmes and Watson alone in the gradually settling silence of 221B. Watson, knowing his friend's habits well, settled into his accustomed chair by the fire, which had burned down to glowing embers that cast a gentle, ruddy light across the room. "You believe there's more to this smuggling operation than has yet been revealed," he observed. It was not a question. Holmes nodded, finally setting aside the pumpkin and joining Watson by the fire. "Mycroft's interest suggests dimensions beyond simple customs evasion. The sophistication of the encryption, the carefully established network of drop points, the involvement of someone with access to specialized government ink formulations. These elements point to an organization with considerable resources and connections." Yet the decoded message mentioned only luxury goods, teas, silks, and porcelains, Watson noted. "Valuable, certainly, but hardly matters of state importance." "Unless," Holmes replied, his voice taking on that particular quality it held when following a chain of deduction to its conclusion, "the luxury goods are merely a cover for something else entirely, something sufficiently valuable or sensitive to justify such elaborate precautions." Watson considered this possibility as he gazed into the embers. The Halloween night was drawing toward its close, the final hours stretching toward dawn with that peculiar stillness that comes when most of London sleeps. Outside, a distant church bell marked the half-hour, its sound muted by distance but clear in the quiet. "We shall know more tomorrow," Holmes said finally, reaching for his pipe and the familiar ritual of filling it with tobacco from the Persian slipper. The strike of a match illuminated his features momentarily. The high forehead, the hawk-like nose, the keen eyes now thoughtful in repose, before subsiding to the steady glow of the pipe bowl. The lone candle in the question-marked pumpkin had finally burned down, its flame flickering one last time before extinguishing with a small trail of smoke that curled upward like a spectral signature. With its passing, the carved guardians that had overseen the evening's festivities now sat in darkness, their expressions hidden until daylight would once again reveal them. In the gentle quiet that followed, with the fire's embers slowly cooling, and the subtle aroma of Holmes's pipe tobacco, mingling with the lingering scents of spices, autumn leaves, and pumpkin, 221B Baker Street settled into its nighttime aspect, a sanctuary of thought and companionship, where even the most complex mysteries eventually yielded to the patient application of reason. Halloween night had brought its share of mysteries, coded messages, and collaborative deductions. Tomorrow would bring resolution to the puzzle of the Scarecrow courier and the smuggled goods. But for now, in these quietest hours between midnight and dawn, there was just the comfortable silence of two friends by a dying fire, contemplating the curious case of the pumpkin papers and the satisfying knowledge that, once again, hidden truths had been brought to light. Morning arrived at 221B Baker Street with gentle insistence, autumn sunlight filtering through the windows and illuminating the remnants of the previous evening's Halloween festivities. The carved pumpkins, their expressions now visible in daylight rather than by their own inner illumination, seemed to regard the room with benign amusement. Autumn leaves, arranged so carefully along the mantelpiece by Mrs. Hudson, had settled into a more natural disarray, as if remembering their original purpose as wind-blown things rather than decorations. Holmes had risen early, as was his habit when engaged with a case. Watson found him already dressed and seated at the breakfast table, where several newspapers were spread before him. The familiar scent of Mrs. Hudson's fresh coffee filled the room, mingling with the lingering aromas of the previous night's celebration, spices, candle wax, and the subtle, earthy scent of the pumpkins. "Good morning, Watson," Holmes greeted without looking up from his reading. "I trust you slept well, despite our late retirement?" "Remarkably well, in fact," Watson replied, taking his accustomed seat and reaching for the coffee pot. "There's something about solving puzzles that leads to particularly restful sleep. Perhaps the satisfaction of bringing order to chaos." Holmes looked up at this observation, a slight smile touching his lips. "An interesting theory. I have often found the opposite, that one puzzle solved tends to reveal 3 more in its place, rather like turning over a fallen log to find an entire ecosystem of questions beneath." "And is that the case with our pumpkin papers?" Watson inquired, buttering a piece of toast from the rack Mrs. Hudson had left, warming by the fire. "Have new questions emerged since last night?" "Several," Holmes confirmed, pushing one of the newspapers toward Watson. "Most notably regarding the nature of the operation Lestrade will be intercepting today. The morning papers report an interesting development. A fire at a warehouse near the docks late last night, after our guests had departed." Watson scanned the article quickly, his expression growing more concerned as he read. No casualties reported, thankfully, but extensive damage to a building owned by the Eastern Trading Company. "You believe this is connected to our smuggling operation?" "The timing suggests more than coincidence," Holmes replied, sipping his coffee with a thoughtful expression. "Particularly considering the location, less than half a mile from the South Warehouse mentioned in our decoded message." "A warning? Or perhaps destruction of evidence?" Watson speculated, his medical mind automatically considering possibilities and their implications. "Possibly both," Holmes nodded. I sent a note to Lestrade at first light, suggesting he adjust his plans accordingly. The fire will have alerted our smugglers that something has gone awry, which means they are likely to change their delivery location. But without knowing the new location, Watson began. "Ah, but we do have a means of discovering it," Holmes interrupted, his eyes brightening with that particular gleam that Watson recognized as the thrill of intellectual pursuit. "The pumpkin map, Watson. If my theory is correct, the question-marked pumpkin serves as the control point for the operation. Changes to the established routine would be communicated from there. And Lestrade has access to the Scarecrow's pumpkin, which should match our question-marked specimen." Watson completed the thought, understanding dawning, giving him the key to locate their headquarters. "Precisely," Holmes confirmed, rising from the table with sudden energy. "I've arranged to meet Lestrade at Scotland Yard within the hour to examine this physical key to our mystery. I was about to send a message inviting you to join us, but your timely awakening has saved me the trouble." Watson smiled, reaching for his coffee cup. "Allow me to finish breakfast at a civilized pace, Holmes. Not all mysteries demand immediate abandonment of morning rituals." Holmes acknowledged this reasonable request with a nod, his own restless energy finding outlet in a circuit of the room while Watson ate. He paused occasionally to examine the spent pumpkins, particularly the question-marked specimen that had provided such a crucial insight the previous evening. "Mrs. Hudson outdid herself with her first Halloween celebration," Watson observed, watching his friend's inspection of the decorations. "I wonder if she intends to make it an annual tradition." "I suspect she might," Holmes replied, carefully turning the question-marked pumpkin in his hands. "She mentioned at least 3 times how pleased she was with the evening's success, though I doubt she anticipated that her decorative gourds would prove instrumental in unraveling a smuggling operation. Few hostesses would include crime-solving opportunities among their party planning considerations," Watson agreed with a chuckle, "though in this household, perhaps, it should be expected." A comfortable silence settled between them, the easy quiet of long friendship that requires no constant maintenance through speech. Outside, London had awakened fully to the first day of November. The sounds of carriage wheels, street vendors, and the general rhythm of the city formed a familiar backdrop to their morning, a reminder that beyond the walls of 221B Baker Street, the great human drama of the metropolis continued unabated. Mrs. Hudson appeared briefly to inquire about their satisfaction with breakfast and to begin the process of restoring the sitting room to its normal state. She regarded the Halloween decorations with a mixture of pride and practical assessment. "The pumpkins have served their purpose admirably," she declared, examining one whose carved grin had begun to sag slightly at the edges. "Though I fear they won't last another day indoors. Perhaps the children at the orphanage on Marylebone Road might enjoy them for one more evening before they're beyond saving." "An excellent suggestion, Mrs. Hudson," Holmes approved, "though I would ask that you preserve our question-marked specimen for a while longer. It may yet have a role to play in our investigation." Mrs. Hudson accepted this request with the equanimity of a woman long accustomed to unusual demands from her tenants. "As you wish, Mr. Holmes, though I make no promises about its condition by tomorrow. Nature has its own timetable, regardless of Scotland Yard's requirements." This practical observation drew a smile from both men as Mrs. Hudson departed with her usual efficient grace, leaving them to complete their preparations for the day ahead. The journey to Scotland Yard passed pleasantly enough, the November morning having dawned clear and crisp after the previous night's rainfall. The streets still held puddles that reflected the blue sky and occasional passing clouds, while the air carried that particular freshness that follows autumn storms, a clarity that seemed to sharpen the edges of buildings and the colours of the few remaining leaves on London's trees. Lestrade was waiting for them in his office, his expression suggesting a mix of professional focus and suppressed excitement. On his desk sat an evidence box, which he opened as soon as greetings had been exchanged. "The Scarecrow's pumpkin, as requested, Mr. Holmes," he announced, carefully lifting a small, round specimen from the box. "And I must say, your note about the warehouse fire proved most timely. We've redirected our surveillance efforts accordingly." Holmes took the pumpkin, turning it carefully to examine every aspect of its surface. A slow smile of satisfaction spread across his features as he located what he had been seeking, a natural marking in the form of a question mark, nearly identical to the one that had decorated the pumpkin at Baker Street. "As I suspected," he murmured, more to himself than to his companions. "The physical key to our pumpkin papers." "You truly believe we can locate their new delivery point through this vegetable?" Lestrade asked, his tone betraying a lingering skepticism, despite his respect for Holmes's methods. "Not the vegetable itself, Inspector, but what it represents," Holmes corrected. "The marking identifies this as coming from the same source as our question-marked pumpkin, the central garden mentioned in the encrypted letter, the place from which instructions are issued." "And you can determine this location how, exactly?" Lestrade pressed, clearly struggling to follow the connection between decorative gourds and criminal enterprises. In response, Holmes reached into his coat pocket and produced a carefully folded sheet of paper, which he spread on Lestrade's desk. It proved to be a map of the counties surrounding London, with particular attention to Kent, the origin of Mrs. Hudson's specially patterned pumpkins. "My investigations this morning, before Watson awoke, included telegraphing several contacts regarding farms in Kent, known for growing ornamental or unusual pumpkin varieties," Holmes explained. "There are, it transpires, only 3 such establishments of any significance, and only one, here," he indicated a location with his finger, "that has a formal garden arrangement with different growing sections that match the descriptions in our coded message." "Thornfield Manor," Lestrade read from the map, his skepticism fading as he began to appreciate the thoroughness of Holmes's research. "Owned by, Sir Richard Blackwood." "Indeed," Holmes confirmed, "a gentleman who has, interestingly enough, spent considerable time in the Far East, and who maintains extensive trading connections with China and Japan. He is also known for his horticultural experiments, including the development of distinctively patterned pumpkin varieties." "The very pumpkins used in the coded descriptions," Watson observed, the pieces falling into place with satisfying clarity. "Precisely," Holmes nodded. "Sir Richard's estate includes an eastern field, a north corner, a stone wall garden, an oak grove, a western patch, and, most significantly, a central garden where his prize specimens are grown, the very locations described in our pumpkin papers." Lestrade's expression had transformed completely, professional excitement now fully evident. "So you believe that after the warehouse fire, They'll redirect the smuggled goods to one of these locations on the estate. To the central garden, most likely. Holmes confirmed. The control point of the operation. In light of the disruption caused by the fire and the Scarecrow courier's capture, they'll want to secure the shipment at their headquarters until new arrangements can be made. With this insight, the morning's activities took on a new direction. Lestrade hurried to organize a proper police contingent for what might prove to be a significant operation, while Holmes and Watson provided additional details about the decoded message and the likely nature of the smuggled goods. By early afternoon, arrangements had been completed. A telegraph from one of Mycroft's associates, delivered with such discretion that even Lestrade did not question its origin, confirmed unusual activity at Thornfield Manor, with several carriages arriving in close succession throughout the morning. It appears our deductions were correct, Holmes observed as they prepared to join Lestrade's operation. The disruption of their London delivery has indeed caused them to fall back to their central location. A considerable risk on their part, Watson noted, bringing contraband directly to Sir Richard's estate, rather than maintaining the separation between their headquarters and their distribution points. Necessity often overrides caution, Holmes replied, and there is a certain logic to it. Who would suspect a respected country gentleman of orchestrating a smuggling operation from his ornamental gardens? The very eccentricity of the arrangement provides a form of camouflage. The journey to Kent passed in thoughtful conversation, Holmes and Watson sharing a private compartment on the train while Lestrade travelled, with his officers in another carriage. The countryside unfolded beyond the windows. Autumn fields harvested to stubble. Woodlands in the last magnificent display of their seasonal colour. Small villages where life continued at a pace dictated by natural rhythms rather than urban demands. There's a certain irony, Watson observed as they watched this peaceful landscape pass, that our Halloween mystery, with all its pumpkins and scarecrows, should lead us to such a quintessentially English rural setting. One could almost imagine we've stepped into a different sort of story entirely. The boundaries between different types of narratives are often more permeable than we imagine, Holmes replied, his gaze distant, as he contemplated the case from multiple angles. What begins as one thing frequently reveals itself to be another entirely, much like our smuggling operation, beginning with luxury goods, but perhaps concealing something more significant. This cryptic observation remained unexplored as the train began to slow, approaching the small station nearest to Thornfield Manor. The practical demands of the operation now took precedence, with Holmes sharing final insights with Lestrade about the layout of the estate and the likely location of the smuggled goods. The events that followed would later be documented in Watson's private notes rather than published accounts, at the request of certain government departments represented by Mycroft Holmes. The raid on Thornfield Manor's central garden, conducted with precision under Lestrade's direction, revealed not only the expected luxury items, tea, silk, and porcelain, but also something far more valuable hidden within them. Diplomatic documents and military intelligence from various Eastern powers smuggled into England disguised as harmless decorative items. Sir Richard Blackwood, confronted with the evidence of his elaborate operation, maintained the dignified composure of a man who had always considered himself beyond the reach of conventional law. His surprise at being discovered was evident only in the slight raising of one aristocratic eyebrow, as Holmes explained the chain of deduction that had led them from a scarecrow pickpocket on Halloween night to the heart of his estate. "The pumpkins," Sir Richard said finally, regarding Holmes with reluctant respect. A whimsical detail that I perhaps should have omitted from our communications protocol. Though I confess I took a certain pride in the elegance of the system, using my own horticultural creations as both the physical keys and the coded map of our operation. Pride in one's ingenuity is often the downfall of otherwise excellent schemes, Holmes observed, neither condemning nor praising, merely stating a principle he had seen demonstrated countless times in his career. With the operation concluded and the evidence secured, the return journey to London carried a sense of completion, that particular satisfaction that comes with bringing complex threads together into a coherent resolution. The train wheels clicked rhythmically over the tracks, a metronomic counterpoint to the conversations in which Lestrade, Holmes, and Watson reflected on the case and its unexpected dimensions. Evening was settling over London as they finally returned to Baker Street, the city's lamps being lit one by one against the gathering November darkness. Mrs. Hudson greeted them with her usual perceptiveness, noting their tired but satisfied expressions and promptly arranging for a substantial supper to be served in the sitting room. The space had been largely restored to its normal appearance. The Halloween decorations removed save for the question-marked pumpkin, which remained on the mantelpiece as Holmes had requested. Its presence now seemed like a souvenir of their adventure, a tangible reminder of how a seasonal celebration had unexpectedly intertwined with a case of international significance. As they settled before the fire with their pipes after supper, a comfortable silence enveloped the room. The familiar scents of tobacco, wood smoke, and the lingering trace of Mrs. Hudson's excellent cooking created an atmosphere of home that contrasted pleasantly with the day's activities. "I find myself wondering," Watson said eventually, watching the smoke from his pipe curl toward the ceiling, "what Mrs. Hudson's cousin in America would make of how her Halloween traditions translated to London. I doubt she anticipated that carved pumpkins and scarecrows would feature in the unraveling of an espionage operation." Holmes smiled, his own pipe sending lazy spirals of smoke to join Watson's. Cultural adaptations often take unexpected forms. The transplanting of Halloween to English soil seems to have yielded a uniquely Baker Street variation. "Speaking of adaptations," Watson continued, reaching for a small notebook on the side table, "I've been considering how I might document this case for my records. The adventure of the pumpkin papers, perhaps, though I suspect much of it will remain private, given Mycroft's involvement and the diplomatic sensitivities." "A wise precaution," Holmes agreed, "though the core elements, the coded message, the scarecrow courier, the pumpkin map, would make for an entertaining account, suitably modified to protect certain interests." The question-marked pumpkin on the mantelpiece caught the firelight, its distinctive pattern throwing an elongated shadow on the wall behind it. Tomorrow it will begin to fade, following the natural course of all organic things. But for tonight, it maintained its vigilant presence, a silent witness to the conclusion of the mystery it had helped to solve. Outside, London continued its nocturnal rhythm, unaware of the quiet satisfaction within 221B Baker Street. November had arrived, sweeping away the spectral whimsy of Halloween and bringing its own particular character to the city, a more restrained, introspective season that suited both Holmes and Watson in their different ways. "There is something to be said for these transitional moments," Holmes observed, following his own line of thought in a way that none the less connected with their shared contemplation of the season. the boundaries between October and November, between mystery and resolution, between the visible and the hidden. It is in these threshold spaces that the most interesting truths often emerge. Watson nodded, understanding, as always, the philosophical current that occasionally surfaced in his friend's otherwise pragmatic approach to the world. And yet, we always seek resolution, the transformation of mystery into order. It seems to be a fundamental human need. Perhaps, Holmes agreed, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames in the grate. Though I sometimes wonder if the true ghost that haunts us is not uncertainty, but the certainty we create to banish it. Our explanations become the spectres that follow us, shaped by our need for narrative coherence, rather than the chaotic reality they attempt to describe. This unusually metaphysical observation hung in the air between them, neither requiring response nor dismissal, simply existing as part of the evening's gentle unwinding. The case was solved, the pumpkin papers decoded, the smuggling operation dismantled. Tomorrow would bring new puzzles, new questions, new mysteries seeking resolution. But for now, in the quiet aftermath of their Halloween adventure, Baker Street offered its particular sanctuary, a place where even the most complex problems could, for a time, be resolved into the simple pleasure of firelight, friendship, and the satisfaction of a mystery well solved. The question-marked pumpkin watched over this scene with its distinctive silhouette, a final Halloween guardian keeping vigil as November's first night deepened around the most famous address in London, where once again the hidden had been brought to light, and the mysterious rendered comprehensible through the patient application of reason and deduction.